For those of you who don't know Republic 3.0 yet, our purpose is to find and come up with the best practical policy solutions emerging from Capitol Hill, think tanks, academia, advocacy groups, and industry, and get those out to readers in digestible, easy-to-read form. We do this by introducing original reporting and commentary, commissioning op-eds, commentary, or other pieces from external contributors. To place on the site, we do interviews with key policymakers, business leaders, and thinkers, and like today, we host opportunities for in-person dialogues through public events like this that help highlight current and upcoming policy debates, where we seek to find common ground and new ideas. With that, we're very happy to be hosting today's event. As everyone in the room knows, next year will hopefully be a big year for the rewrite of the 1996 Telecom Act. We've assembled an expert panel today where we'll be able to have that discussion in advance of the next Congress, hopefully getting the dialogue started and ideas flowing. Before we get to our panel, I'm very happy that we have a bipartisan leader who was instrumental in the formation and passage of the 1996 Act, former Congressman Boucher. During his 28 years in Congress, Mr. Boucher served on both the House Energy and Commerce Committee and the Judiciary Committee, chairing the subcommittees on energy and air quality and communications, technology, and energy. Congressman Boucher was a leader in every major congressional telecoms policy debate over the past 25 years. He chaired the subcommittee that oversaw the commercialization of the internet and its transition from a government-owned R&D project to the all-encompassing presence it is today. In that role, he authored the 1992 law that permitted the first commercial use of the internet. He was also one of two co-founders of the Congressional Internet Caucus and served as co-chairman of the 170-member group for about 15 years. As I just said, Mr. Boucher helped fashion the Telecommunications Act of 1996, being instrumental in drafting the legislation. As such, I think we'll all use his perspectives on opportunities for the rewrite will be especially helpful and interesting. Currently, the Congressman is head of Sidley Austin's government affairs practice. And with that, please help me welcome Congressman Boucher.
Rob, thanks so much. I appreciate the invitation to be here, and thank you for hosting this event on what for me is very familiar terrain here in 2218. This is a great room that the Energy and Commerce Committee uses for events exactly like this. I think at all the time I served on the committee, I'm strange to remember a single actual hearing that we had in this room. But typically those were downstairs or upstairs, but this room is a terrific setting for the kind of conversation we're having today. So thank you very much, Rob, for inviting my participation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Telecom Act that we hope will be a primary topic on the agenda of the Commerce Committees and both the House and the Senate and the Congress to come. I'll mention the need for reform, which I suspect everyone in this room is more or less obvious. I'll talk about the process to date that has occurred as a workup to a possible reform, and also mention a couple of issues, some elements that I think would be appropriate candidates for inclusion in the reform. So first, observations on the need for reform and the process to date. The telecom marketplace has been dramatically transformed in the 18 years since we passed the 1996 Communications Act. That act was really not forward-looking. It was about the service of its day, which was plain old telephone service. So in the 96 Act, you saw big debates and decisions about the conflict between local providers of phone service and long-distance providers, and the Act rationalized the way for the Bell operating companies that were local providers to get into the long-distance market on a nationwide basis. It was about the creation of competition in the local telephone exchange, and so cable companies and others were welcomed in as voice providers in the local exchange. But to a very great extent, that act was just about the service of its day. It was about voice service, and it was not forward-looking. For example, the internet was mentioned exactly once in the 1996 Act, and that was in a much maligned provision called the Communications Decency Act, which the Supreme Court in a rare 9-0 vote found to be unconstitutional. So the only venture that was made by members of Congress in the '96 Act to even think about the internet was headed in the wrong direction. Now, of course, the landscape is fundamentally different, and today the internet stands at the core of virtually all modern communications, and that will be even more true in the future than it is at the present. And so, to state the obvious, the law now needs to be modernized in order to meet that current reality. As a Democrat, it might come with some credibility when I say that having one party, in this case the Republican Party, in control of both houses of Congress and in control of the leadership of the Congress committees in the House and Senate, may actually facilitate the consideration of Communications Act reform. It creates the opportunity, for example, for the leadership of the Congress committees on a bicameral basis to talk about a common agenda, perhaps even to agree on what some of the fundamental elements of telecom reform should be, and to create a workable foundation for that debate to begin to take place more or less simultaneously, perhaps, in both the House and in the Senate. So the first point I would make is that I think there's a strong possibility that single-party control can be a facilitating element in terms of Communications Act reform. Having said that, it's also apparent that only issues that have a bipartisan foundation and a fairly broad range of bipartisan support can make it to the finish line. After all, it still is necessary to have 60 votes in the Senate to pass anything remotely controversial. Neither party has that, and the presidential signature would be necessary at the end of the day for matters to become law. The process to date has been, I think, more thoughtful and more leadership directed, more strategic, if you will, than the process that we had in 1996. That process was about an 8-year process beginning in 1988, and it was very much bottom up. Individual members introduced items of legislation in which they had a particular interest. And that literally began in 1988 with the first measures that would enable telephone companies to offer cable TV service inside their telephone service areas. That was a provision that made its way into the '96 Act. Other provisions, such as local exchange competition for voice service, were also put forward by individual members and made their way into the '96 Act. It wasn't until fairly late in the process that the leadership of the committees, House and Senate, beginning in the House, later in the Senate, got involved in the process. Effectively, they saw a parade forming, they got around to the front and said, "Follow me." But they did an effective job. And in the end, I commend the leadership, House and Senate, back in 1996 for bringing a comprehensive reform that created the first real intermodal competition in telecom to the finish line. It was a job very well done. This time around, the leadership, particularly on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, has gotten involved on the front end. Chairman Upton and Walden, I think, have done a superb job. And again, as a Democrat, perhaps when I say that, it comes with some measure of credibility. But I really admire the leadership they've taken on this issue today. They started with a series of white papers and invited broad stakeholder comment on a range of issues. They've issued a total of 5 white papers to date and received reams of comment from the private sector and from public interest groups with interests across the spectrum. That's a very thoughtful and strategic way to begin the conversation. They also have, I think, a realistic time frame for reform. They set the past 2 years, this year now almost concluded, and the previous year, for the receipt of recommendations on what would constitute a meaningful telecom reform. And as I indicated, they got a broad range of comment. They have indicated that the 2 years to come will be for the regular legislative process, for the drafting of reform legislation, the legislative hearings that will follow that, the markups, passage in both houses, conferencing. Candidly, that may take more than 2 years. I'll be surprised if it doesn't, but they've made a great start, and I think the time frame will be considerably shorter for this reform than it was for the 8-year reform process we had leading up to 1996. Another observation that I think is important about these issues is that historically, telecom issues have had a strong bipartisan foundation. Rarely ever do you see a partisan divide on telecom. Now, that's not to say that issues are not heavily contested and heavily debated, because they are, but the divides tend to be along perhaps geographic lines, where you have an urban view and a non-urban view, or they may be along sector-specific lines, where you have cable lining up against broadcasters, lining up against wired telcos, everybody keeping an eye on what's going on in the wireless market. So you may have sector-specific, industry-specific debates, but the debates are almost never partisan. Now, there is one clear, notable current exception to that, and that is the issue of network neutrality. And I'm going to have a word to say about network neutrality in just a moment. So what are the issues that deserve a place on the telecom agenda? What are the issues that, taken together, assuming that they pass, would constitute a substantial and adequate modernization of the telecom law? What are the issues that can drive a substantial bipartisan majority, issue by issue, that would enable the legislation to clear the hurdles that exist in the Senate and be signed by the President? I'm going to suggest the following. First, I think Congress should identify barriers that stand in the way of the complete transition from the circuit switch telephone network to all IP networks over a short period of time. And by that, I would suggest the end of this decade. And then once the statutory barriers to that complete transition have been identified by the Congress, legislation should clear those barriers away to enable the transition to occur. Bipartisan support clearly exists for making this transition. As a matter of fact, Tom Wheeler, before he chaired the FCC, chaired a body internal to the FCC known as the Technical Advisory Committee. And in that capacity, he recommended to the FCC that the circuit switch telephone network sunset by the year 2020. Why did he make that recommendation? I think there are a couple of key reasons. First, the network is old and it's wearing out. The equipment manufacturers don't make as much in the way of replacement parts for it as they used to. And the parts that are available, therefore, are a lot more costly. And telcos are spending a disproportionate amount of their capital expenditures maintaining an old network that consumers are fleeing. And those numbers are really revealing. Only 5% of communications users today rely exclusively on the old circuit switch telephone network for their telecommunications needs. Another 28% of users use it in combination with a wireless service. But 2/3 of communications users have fled the old circuit switch network altogether. When I saw those numbers, I was surprised at how dramatic the transition away from that network already is. And this is before government does anything to facilitate a broader transition. But the facilitation of a broader transition is needed. As I indicated, telephone companies are spending a lot of money, estimated at about $13 billion a year, just maintaining the old network that consumers are fleeing. That's a dollar not spent on the modern networks consumers prefer. And it would be far better to try to redirect that investment to the networks of the future rather than having them invested in the networks of the past where the user numbers are declining rapidly year by year. The new networks are much more capable and better for consumers. They offer multimedia services, whereas the old circuit switch network essentially offers a single service, telephone service. You can get DSL over it. Not a lot of people are doing that, declining numbers year by year. And so the first issue that I think Congress needs to tackle in terms of communications reform is just clearing away the barriers that would inhibit a complete transition by the end of this decade to all IP networks. And the FCC, under Chairman Wheeler, has now approved on a bipartisan basis the first trial of that transition taking place in one urban locality and one rural locality. So moving to all IP networks is an important objective. Those networks are more likely regulated at the FCC. Broadband is classified as an information service and hopefully is going to remain that way, and I'll have a comment about that in a minute. But even though those networks are likely regulated, it's important to note that when the transition occurs and everyone is using IP for communications, it will not be a regulation-free zone. There has been a broad agreement between broadband providers on the one hand and public service, public interest organizations, one notable one on the other, and that is the Center for Democracy and Technology, about a set of core consumer protection principles that would apply in a transition network. And those principles are these. First of all, no one would be left behind. The principle of universal service would continue to be respected. And at the end of the transition, everyone would receive a service at least as good as the service that they have today. First responder access, the 911 service, would be as available on the new networks and as reliable as it is on the old network today. Disability access for the vision impaired and hearing impaired would continue on the new network just as it does on the old. There would be a place for consumers to take complaints about their service provider's conduct with the reasonable expectation of rapid resolution of those complaints, be that the FCC or a state authority. And competition would be respected on the new network as competition is respected on the circuit switch network today. And broadband providers across the board have agreed that these principles of consumer protection need to be respected and, where necessary, enforced with appropriate regulation with regard to the new network. So Congress ought to proceed in a telecom reform with the assumption that this transition will occur and take every step necessary in terms of legislation in order to make sure that it can. The second issue on the reform agenda is also something that appears on just about everybody's suggested list of topics, and that is to restructure the FCC for a complete transition away from a industry-specific or sectoral approach to regulation in favor of a functional approach to regulation. The fact that there is a sectoral approach at the FCC today is kind of a reflection of the way that the Communications Act itself is structured. That act has a common carrier title, it has a cable title, there's a wireless title, and you see that legislative structure reflected in the structure of the FCC. Now, only Congress can change that. The FCC can't do it administratively. So, let's get rid of the stovepipes. And let's recognize that in today's reality, you've got cable companies competing with telephone companies, competing with wireless companies, offering the same set of multimedia services. And where companies are offering the same services, they should be regulated according to that function and not according to the industry that happens to be their historic genesis. So they should all be regulated the same way, and there should be regulatory parity across the board. That almost goes without saying, but it deserves a strong place on the telecom agenda. We also should reform the federal Lifeline program. And this has been discussed now for at least a decade in the Congress with no resolution, and the program to a large extent remains as it was written in the 1980s. So it is a 20th century program that supports a 19th century technology. Today, the Lifeline program is about $1.8 billion on an annual basis. It's got something on the order of 13 million eligible recipients. And these individuals, to a large extent, have been enabled to get basic telephone service by virtue of the Lifeline program. It is valuable, it needs to be continued, but it needs to be reformed. And the first obvious reform is to expand the Lifeline program to broadband. Today, it only subsidizes voice service. While I think there's broad agreement on the need to expand Lifeline to broadband, there's never been, until perhaps now, an obvious way to do that didn't explode the cost of the program. If you're going to continue to make it available for voice and you add broadband on top of that, stands to reason it's going to cost more. And there's been real reluctance to take that step if you could expect the program to become more expensive. Well, there is a simple change that can respect the new power that consumers have in the market to essentially shop in a competitive communications marketplace. And let's harness that consumer power as a means of expanding the Lifeline program to broadband. Simply, that could be done by issuing to eligible subscribers a Lifeline benefit card. This would be for their monthly $9 and some cents subsidy, and then let them go shopping. If they want voice service, they can buy a voice service from any number of competing providers. If they want broadband service, they can purchase a broadband service using that $9 a month subsidy in order to do so, and there are competing providers for that as well. So empower consumers, let them make the choice of the Lifeline supported service that is best for them. Here's one other reform of the Lifeline program that makes a lot of sense, and it can reduce the Lifeline program's cost, streamline it, make it more efficient, and that is to stop allowing carriers to determine eligibility of the subscribers. Today, it is the carrier that makes that determination. And carriers have all the wrong incentives because they want more subscribers. You know, close cases by some carriers are going to be called in favor of qualifying a subscriber who perhaps is not entitled to the benefit. This is inherently a governmental function, so let's trust a governmental agency to perform it. The Universal Service Administrative Corporation at the FCC could do that very well. The state PUCs could do it very well. But if you empower a governmental agency that will be a neutral arbiter, it's obvious to me the program cost is going to come down because only the people who are really eligible are going to receive the Lifeline benefit card. There's a recently released white paper from the Internet Innovation Alliance, which I would recommend to you if you're interested in how the Lifeline program functions, how it can be effectively reformed, and you can go to the website of the Internet Innovation Alliance and get chapter and verse on the Lifeline program. And not surprisingly, the two reforms I've just mentioned are also contained in that white paper. That deserves a place, I think, on the agenda. The fourth issue I'll mention, and I'm going to stop with this one and then come to the question of network neutrality, which I'll comment on briefly. But the fourth issue deals with spectrum, which is perhaps the single most important telecommunications subject today. There's an interesting number, which I'm sure many in this room are aware of. If you're not, I think you'll find it interesting. And that is that the AWS auction, which is now underway, and will probably conclude in the not-too-distant future when bidders finally stop upping the ante, has already topped $38 billion. It's on its way to $40 billion. It may get to $40 billion by the time the auction closes. That is double the old record for a spectrum auction, which was set in 2007 with the 700 megahertz auction, which netted $20 billion. I recall that very well. It doesn't seem like it was so far ago that we had the DTV transition and the analog spectrum broadcasters were using was put on the auction block. That's the 700 megahertz spectrum. And we were thinking, wow, if we get $15 billion for this, we're going to be doing really well. We were shocked. $20 billion sure seemed like a lot of money then. Today, the value of the auction is $40 billion. And it just demonstrates how important that spectrum is, how much consumers are driving toward the wireless market, and how much more spectrum we're going to need in order to meet that ever-escalating demand for mobile data service. Which leads me to a suggestion. The place where we can get spectrum most conveniently and make it available for the mobile market is from the government agencies that hold a very large inventory of it at the present time. The process we currently have for reallocating spectrum from the government agencies for commercial auction is broken. It just doesn't work very well. The agencies are reluctant to give up spectrum. Once it's been reallocated through a long process, they don't want to vacate it. It takes forever to get the spectrum cleared and made available to the mobile providers. So let's try a whole new approach. Let's try incentives. You know, we've learned something from the experience of the incentive auction and the rules the FCC is now putting in place, and that is that one way to coax more spectrum into the market is to let the spectrum holder share in the auction proceeds. Let's try that for government. It can't work any worse than the current system, which is badly broken, and is so slow that we're not getting spectrum delivered as quickly as we should. Let's try letting the government spectrum holders share in the auction proceeds. Then they can use those revenues to tailor their communications needs in a very targeted way and purchase the services that they will have to have. I think we should also make the spectrum licenses flexible. They're pretty inflexible today. If you take place in a terrestrial wireless auction, you can offer with what you buy a terrestrial wireless service. If you take place in a satellite auction, you can use that spectrum you purchase for satellite to ground communications. But what you're then using it for may not be the highest and best use. It may not be the most market efficient use of that spectrum. You may not be putting it to the highest public purpose either. And so let the market decide. Let's say that once a spectrum is bought, it can be used for whatever purpose the market dictates. So the spectrum holder can use it for any purpose that is relevant and that is consistent with guiding public policy principles. That would also stimulate the secondary market for spectrum, and I think would be highly economically efficient and would make sure that more spectrum goes to where the demand is the greatest. That's another important consideration for Communications Act reform. Now, I think if those issues taken together make it to the finish line, that will be a pretty efficient modernization of the law. It will meet a lot of current needs, and I think these are also issues that can command bipartisan support. So I would nominate these topics, at least as a foundation for the committees to do their work. I'm going to say just a word about network neutrality. Today, broadband is lightly regulated, and the FCC, I think, made a wise decision when it classified broadband as an information service. If that decision is reversed with a determination that broadband is a telecommunications service applying monopoly-era regulations to what has been a dynamic and very successful infrastructure, which attracts a huge amount of investment, the progress we've had is going to be halted, and I think it's a fundamentally bad idea. I support network neutrality. I see many familiar faces in this room who were with us during the debates we had starting a decade ago on the subject of network neutrality. And I've always been on the side of saying that we need clear rules, enforceable rules to promote network openness. I still feel that way. But Section 706 of the Communications Act offers to the FCC, with its existing statutory authority, a clear answer to that challenge, a complete remedy to assure network openness. and they can apply their Section 706 authority to assure network neutrality while keeping the service, the broadband service, as an information service, lightly regulated and not put barriers in the way of investment, which is what would happen if there were a reclassification. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, we hear all that, we've heard these arguments from others too. So what's that got to do with the subject that we're talking about here today, which is Communications Act reform? Here's the nexus. If the FCC reclassifies broadband as a telecommunications service, I think, frankly, you can put on the shelf any idea of having comprehensive telecom reform in the Congress to come. That issue is so emotional. It is so, it raises everybody's blood pressure so much. It is such a debate that brings out partisan instincts on both sides of the aisle, and so unusual as a telecom issue for that reason, that I think having that be injected into the congressional setting, which it inevitably would be if the FCC reclassifies, just destroys any opportunity to get to these four more fundamental issues and to pass a comprehensive Communications Act reform. It's a reality. If reclassification happens, you can imagine what the reaction in Congress is going to be. Bills will be introduced and processed to overturn the reclassification. Hearings will be held. The FCC will be repeatedly brought before the Communications Committee and subcommittee of the House Committee, called before the Senate Commerce Committee, and a lot of time and effort is going to be spent on this debate, of which many people, frankly, at this point are just plain weary. But the temperature still rises, the partisanship is fierce, and it's going to make it very difficult to get to the issues of real communications reform if reclassification happens. That's my prediction. I hope it doesn't. The FCC has a remedy before it using Section 706. Hopefully, calm minds will prevail, and the Commission's going to get to that. I've taken longer than I should have. Thank you very much. I appreciate your invitation to be here. I always love coming back to the Energy and Commerce Committee terrain here, and I hope that you have a successful. Thank you very much.
Just one housekeeping thing. If you ran out on some packets, so if we're going to email out the packets to everyone who's here. If you feel like if we don't have your email, come up afterwards, give me your card. Grab and check in or whatever. Just do that, and I will make sure you guys get the packets. So let's thank our panelists for being here. The way we're going to do this is each panelist is going to give really brief remarks, about 5 minutes, and then we'll do it kind of succession, and then we'll do a Q&A period among everyone here. Looking at the RSVP list, the majority of the room here could also be on this panel, so I think this would be just as good to be a dialogue as a being talked to. So what I'd like to do is start with Rob Atkinson, and I'd like to thank you, Rob, for being here today. Rob is the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, a nonpartisan research and educational institute whose mission is to formulate and promote public policies to advance technological innovation and productivity internationally in Washington and in the States. Rob is definitely one of the country's most foremost experts in innovation, and is also a frequent contributor to Republic Truth. Thank you for that. Why don't we start with you, Rob?
Okay, well, thanks, Rob. First of all, I think I should just pass it on to Sean, because the congressman said pretty much everything I wanted to say, and ticked me off that he did that. But I do want to say a couple of quick things about overall reform, rewrite of the act, and then a couple of quick things about how you would incorporate a progressive take on that. The first thing is, I think we have to remember that rewriting the Telecom Act is a little bit like buying a smartphone. You really, really want one, but you don't want to buy the iPhone 5 the day before the 6 comes out, because if you're locked in. So in some ways, like waiting longer is better, because you just can't predict. It's not like reauthorizing the ag bill, which never changes. It's like it's writing about something that is evolving very, very rapidly. So there's a risk of doing something because you're going to be out of date. the same time, we're still on, iPhone 1 of the Telecom Act, and now we're in iPhone 6 needs of the Telecom Act, so you got to do something. It's really hard to predict this stuff. I remember, Congressman mentioned the internet was only in the '96 Act once. There's a great book, not a great book, actually, a book by Alvin Toffler. If you know Alvin Toffler, the famous futurist, wrote a book in 1994. He predicted that the major thing in this whole space was going to be televised shopping. Didn't mention the word internet once in his 1994 book. Alvin Toffler was a super smart guy. He was paid to think about the future. He couldn't think about it. So the point is, we just really don't know what's going to happen. The second point, I think, is that in a lot of ways we should fundamentally get the principle right first. And the principle in '96 was competition. I think that was good or bad. It had some good and bad effects. I think the principle here is fundamentally has to be what the Congress did, which is about moving to all IP network system, and that we move away from stovepipes. And essentially what we're now talking about regulating are IP networks, and then mostly everything else is going to evolve into an over-the-top app. Now, video, we still have video channels, but at some point, certainly in my son's life, and probably my life, a large share of people are just going to be doing everything over the top. Phone will be an over-the-top app. Video will be an over-the-top app. In my view, if we did it right, first responders stuff is an over-the-top app. And so what we're really talking about is having a system of IP networks, wireless, cable, telephone lines, whatever, that are running bits. And I think, and the key thing there that as the Congressman said is get rid of stovepipes and think about how to do that. With regard to this sort of concept of what a progressive take would look on it like, I think there's several things here. I think the consumer protection part is right, but the one thing maybe I would mention to that is I think there's a risk of applying consumer protection the exact same way. So in the old telephone system, it was what, 5 nines, whatever, how many nines it was, reliability on the phone system. It was like 99.999% quality. IP network is not going to be in that 5 nines. It's not going to be 5 nines, but so maybe it'll be 3 nines or 2 nines. 99.9% of your calls will go through. So possibly you'll have slightly worse problems, but what we have to remember there, you're going to have a vast array of new things you can do on an IP network that you cannot do on a phone network. You're going to talk about disability access, all sorts of things you're going to be able to do on an IP network. So this notion of applying every single rule that we have to get the exact same protection to consumers, I think is a mistake. Part of what we're going to be talking about here is trading off perhaps slightly less protection with significantly more functionality. I think a second area is about licensed and unlicensed spectrum. There's this big debate and a general broad overgeneralization. Conservatives like auction, like property rights and licensed spectrum. Liberals like unlicensed. And I think the reality is we're going to be moving to a system where we have to have a robust system and allocations for both licensed and unlicensed. And it's not an ideological, it should not be an ideological question. We have a little document coming out shortly on Ronald Coase and why you could actually apply Ronald Coase to an unlicensed regime. So it's totally opposite. Everybody thinks Coase is on. And then the third and last part is, we've had a long position on net neutrality, but I agree with the Congressman. It just sucks up all the air. It took Janikowski's efforts. Julius should have been doing. He couldn't do as much because he got wrapped up in this Tom Wheeler, potentially Tom Wheeler's Vietnam. He's going to get sucked down this rat hole. And while this is all going on, while we're essentially spending all of this political capital and time on this, we are not addressing probably the single most important issue, which is how do we get the 30% of Americans who do not use computers, who do not use the internet, how do we get them connected and using the internet? There's a real simple reason why our broadband adoption rates are not as high as some countries. We're actually higher than Europe overall, but why are some countries higher? It has nothing to do with our networks. It has nothing to do with the price of our networks. It has to do with the fact that in the OECD we have the third lowest percentage of people who own a computer. So Mexico and Greece. Yeah, that's not really good company to be in. You're in Finland, you got 97% of people who own a computer. In the US, you got 70% essentially, or 73%. Figuring that out, to me, is the central progressive challenge of the Rewrite Act. So, the Rewrite Act is going to essentially be a set of horse trading and trade-offs. And in my view, what progressives should trade is essentially trade off this sort of fundamentalist net neutrality regime that groups like Free Press want to do for a really progressive goals of getting a lot more Americans online, whether they're rural or urban. Now, when I say trade-off net neutrality, very, very clear. We don't mean that companies, carriers should be able to block or all of that stuff. Absolutely not. But there is legitimate, there are legitimate needs to be able to treat traffic differently. Because I don't know about you, but when I try to make a Skype call on this or on my computer, it actually doesn't work always very well because the bits are contending with my email bits. And Skype calls, or the VoIP calls, in other words, latency-sensitive traffic on networks is very, very different than email traffic. Does anybody here care whether your email arrives 40 milliseconds late? I know you probably do because you're like desperately on your email all the time. Like, oh, geez, I missed that, my boss, 40 milliseconds. In other words, 24 cents a second. You fundamentally don't care, but you do care if that you're talking to your sister or your brother in another city, and the Skype and the bits are like, you care about that. So we need a net neutrality regime that allows differentiation in how bits are done, as long as it's pro-consumer and not anti-competitive. And that, frankly, was Wheeler's original proposal. So if I were on the Hill and I'm on the Democratic side of the aisle, I would say that's a pretty good trade. Let's have that framework for net neutrality, offer it up to Republicans, but insist upon a really, really robust program so that people can make sure we can get the 30% of folks down to 5 or 10% within 5 to 10 years. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rob. Thank you. Right at 5 minutes. So our next panelist is Sean Chang. Most of you know Sean, and Sean just started work at Wiley Grind this week, right, Monday. And while he's there, he'll continue to work on telecom policy. And he was most recently the Democratic Chief Counsel on Communications and Technology for the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Sean?
So thank you, Rob, for having me. And it's always really fun to be back, even though I've only been gone for a couple of weeks. And a real quick anecdote is this is the room where, on a very bipartisan basis, the Chief Counsel for the Energy and Commerce Committee, myself and David Riddle, sat down with the FCC, the NTIA, and the DOD on a monthly basis for the past year, working with every single agency, setting deadlines and checking in on the progress in order to make the AWS-3 auction that Congressman Buckley referenced not too long ago happen. And I was still on the Hill when we were cheering each other for actually getting to $16 billion, which was already beyond anyone's imagination in terms of how much this auction was going to generate. CBO scored that specific auction at $0, and I can talk about that some other day. But we are at 40. Actually, we've already exceeded $40 billion as of yesterday, and the number is going to continue to climb, which will hopefully send the positive signal to anyone who thought that the carriers have more than enough spectrum, they don't need anymore, they don't need to, the efforts at relocating and making spectrum available for commercial mobile services is overrated. And I hope it bodes well for the incentive auction. And I also think this is a good indication that Congress, through the Communications Act process, is going to continue to look at spectrum as one of the unfinished areas, and that more efforts should be put into to ensure that the type of uses that Rob just talked about in an IP-based network will have the necessary capacity and the infrastructure to support that type of ubiquitous usage. So I definitely see spectrum as one of the topics that will be tackled. We, in fact, already have the Federal Spectrum Incentive Act that is modeled after the incentive auction authority that we granted to the FCC back in 2012. and I see that as part of the piece going forward. It's pending in front of the House because of scoring issues, but I think those things are going to be wrapped into a bigger overview of the Communications Act next Congress, and the offsets will be found somewhere in order to move that piece forward. It's just way too important for the nation to not to have a strong pipeline of spectrum that will be available for the next decade to come. And Rob certainly touched on a lot of the themes and that the congressman has touched on. So I was there, basically turning over all the notes that I had before. Just it doesn't make sense anymore. So I have to start over. But I do want to point out a couple of things that I think could be. I just want to highlight a couple of things that the Congressman Boucher, Chairman Boucher had previously mentioned before as some of the areas of possible focus and attention as part of the congressional examination. And one of them, of course, it's extremely important, as Rob has pointed out, the moving our nation to an all-IP network. But I think if you're trying to reconcile, I think Rob pointed out one potential is consumer protection, right, in terms of ensuring whether it's redundancy, reliability, or geolocation accuracy. That's going to be a tension that's there in terms of under our OIP universe, what sort of goal are we going to be striving for? And the other one certainly is going to be on the competition issue. There has been big debates about the backbone interconnection of the networks, and there's also going to be ongoing examination of the availability of the special access market that provides services to competitive carriers that serve primarily a business customer sort of setting. So that is, one of those things in which you are going to have natural tensions between the goals of promoting universal access, consumer protection, public safety, and competition, and at the same time addressing the realities of very large, strong interests on both sides of the debate, trying to make sure that the IP transition will continue to move the nation forward to all IP-based network by providing, continue to offer the services that others have relied upon. So one thing that hasn't been really touched upon very much so far is video competition. That is something that was a huge part of the debate for the satellite reauthorization legislation that we just moved through Congress actually 2 weeks ago. And a lot of the pieces ended up not making onto the reauthorization bill as a vehicle moving forward, but certainly different interests are going to be seeing Communications Act update as a way of advancing the dialogue on retransmission consent and on the types of proposals. You can say that a broadcast a la carte proposal that Senator Dillon and Rockefeller had proposed not too long ago over the summer, and there's a lot of interest in re-engaging that debate. So that certainly, I think, will be a very important big piece that also ties into, as Rob talked about, this movement towards a over-the-top video market and how the satellite and cable and broadcast providers are going to be reacting towards that trend. And finally, I just want to touch really briefly on net neutrality. As staffer for Congressman Waxman, I've spent a ton of time working on that issue, in fact, too long, for the past 6 years. And I think I've always come from the perspective that the Communications Act, especially the update to the Telecommunications Act of 1996, rather than the way that Congressman Boucher has described it as outdated, has indeed provided a lot of flexibility. And one of the flexibility that was provided under the 1996 Act was Section 706, which Congressman Boucher talked about, that provides the authority for the FCC to engage in regulating broadband services just not in the way that the DC Circuit agreed with. So I do think there was a lot of flexibility on the Communication Act for the act to be stretched and accommodated to fit the needs of new services. But from a progressive perspective, which is the topic we're talking about today, I think we should ask, is that the right way to go? Should we really subject the FCC, an agency that has a lot of importance, has in front of it, to a statute that, in order to do the things they want to do, need to go through a lot of legal, creative processes to make the arguments you need to make, then go before the courts, and with the risk of finding a panel of judges that's just completely unsympathetic to the arguments you would be making. I think currently, on the question of whether or not to reclassify the service as a Title II telecommunications service for the purpose of effectuating strong net neutrality protections, both sides of the debate feel very confident that they are going to win before the courts. And there's no question that whatever the FCC does in the next couple of months will end up in courts. And that is not a good recipe, in my opinion, in this the service actually to the Telecommunications Commission to be subject to that type of potential threat and challenges. And it certainly, as Rob has talked about before, will suck up a lot of air in DC and tie up a lot of resources for the Commission. And which brings me back to the point I want to make, that this has been, in my perspective, something that the Congress should take up for a very long time. To provide, even if you want to do it narrowly, to provide a framework for strong net neutrality rules to be established without having to resort to any sort of utility-style price regulation type of existing authority, which, again, one side will argue is completely outdated, the other one side is going to argue is consistent with the way in which Congress has always approached communications policy. Either way, no one knows what's going to happen. The courts will decide, and that means another 2 years of wasted time focusing on this issue. So Congress not only should, but I think has a responsibility to take a look at the issue of net neutrality. And I am an eternal optimist, and I'm going to believe that Congress will be able to find consensus around a set of rules which very few people disagree with. Right? On either side of the issue, it's always about the authority. It's not about what. The what is about how to get there. And I'm optimistic that Congress will be able to rally around a set of issues, a set of rules that will be put into the statute, give the FCC very clear direction in terms of what you should do to protect consumers in the broadband age, and this is the time to do it. So with that, hopefully that's 5 minutes.
It's a little more. Even you, Ben. But thank you, Sean. And the event goes till 1:30. We're hoping to, end it a little bit earlier, but 1:30 is a hard kind of stop. So just FYI, we always stay. Nicole always gets it back because you see it. Next time we'll do it reverse.
That's okay.
But I'm happy to introduce Russell Hanser, who's a partner at Wilkinson Bakery in
Wilkinson Marker now.
Where you work in communications law. Prior to joining the firm, you worked at the FCC in numerous capacities in the Wireline Competition Bureau and the Office of General Counsel, and you served as Wireline Legal Advisor in the Office of the Commissioner Kathleen Abernathy. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks very much for having me, and it's great to be here and good to see current friends and future friends in the audience. So I'll keep my remarks pretty brief. I'm a progressive who spent the majority of my career representing private sector entities, advising them and advocating for them, and I want to speak kind of from that perspective, I guess. So to the extent that we're advising folks on progressive priorities for a new act, I'd say a couple of things. I'd say we should start with the premise, which I think we all take for granted, and certainly this audience knows, but we need to remember that the internet is probably the greatest force for progressive change that's ever been invented. there have been individual institutions and groups that have created great change, but as a technological development, it's hard to, maybe the printing press, but otherwise, the internet is a huge force for progressive change. It's a medium that allows otherwise and heretofore unrepresented groups, underrepresented groups, marginalized groups to communicate. It's a medium that allows affinity communities, gay and lesbian children, kids, teens to find others like them, people who have unusual political beliefs outside the traditional American mainstream to join up with one another, people who are obsessed with particular NPR podcasts to talk with one another, new episode of Serial today. So it is a really fundamentally important progressive medium. And I think that that's the fundamental place to start as progressives thinking about a new act. Because the question is, as the Congressman mentioned before, and as I think both Sean and Rob have expressed, the key is how do we promote that medium and how do we promote reliance on that medium to achieve the other progressive aims. And so a couple of things on how we do that. One is fully agree with what's been said about what I'll call generally the consumer protection, public safety kind of obligation. We want to make sure that obligations, consumer protections, accessibility requirements, things like that apply in a reasonable way going forward to new mediums, and that people who rely on those protections are not left behind. Obviously also national security and public safety are incredibly important. We want to carry forward protections there. After that, though, I think what we really want to focus on is just deployment and adoption, and how to promote deployment and adoption. And I think when I talk to progressive friends, whether they're in the industry or not, what I find a lot is a presumption about investment and deployment, and then they want to sort of move to the next step and talk about how do we promote sharing or require sharing of the resources that currently exist. And I think that's a really important step in the analysis when they skip over and sort of assume deployment investment as given, because what we've seen is that that's not the case, and that regulation really does affect deployment and really does affect usage, it affects pricing. And that's where we get into the problems. So, and it's a problem that we've gone through in the past, that, the history repeats. We saw in the 96 Act had what were initially interpreted as very aggressive network sharing requirements, created a bubble and sort of non-facilities-based deployment, which later collapsed and didn't, I think, do anyone good and destroyed a lot of value. So I think what we want to focus on is how do we promote real competition, facilities-based competition, and how do we expand networks into places where they don't exist, and how do we improve the networks where they do exist. And to do so, we need to recognize that there's always a trade-off between sort of managing scarcity, forcing sharing, et cetera, on the one hand, and making sure that deployment persists and increases. We've seen billions and billions invested over time, and the statistics generally show that investment is higher when the folks doing the investing know that they can capitalize on the return and aren't having to socialize the return and share them with their competitors. So I think promoting deployment really has to become a progressive priority as we think about the good that the internet can do in promoting progressive causes. I'd say particularly in the era of Citizens United and other developments that make use of traditional media a little bit more difficult and a little bit more challenging for progressive causes. So I focus a lot on deployment and think about those investment effects. I think it's also important to focus on adoption, as others have said. I won't harp on that. Finally, let me just say one word about Section 706. I may disagree with Sean a slight bit about Section 706. I'm not sure if I do, but if we disagree. But Sean mentioned that 706 sort of forces the FCC into making creative arguments to the court about how its regulations are not common carriage. I'm not sure we know enough yet to know that that's true under the DC Circuit precedent. So we had the Celco case about data roaming, where the court sort of set out a framework where there's this spectrum of common carriage, and you can get to real common carriage, and you can be somewhere else in the spectrum. In the Verizon case, it actually was fairly straightforward. The Commission had adopted a requirement that mirrored the language of Section 202A, the non-discrimination language, and the court looked at it and said, how can you say that this isn't common carriage? The FCC's main defense, by the way, was not that it wasn't common carriage at all, although it did argue that. Its main defense was, we can't be held to be a common carrier with respect to edge providers and with respect to end users. But the bottom line is, I think 706 and the DC Circuit's ruling, if we take those as given, they give the Commission a lot of leeway to allow a lot of differentiation among service, but still to achieve the objectives that, as Sean says, pretty much everyone agrees with, the sort of policy goals. We can get there under a 706 regime, and my sense is that if the FCC were to adopt this 706 approach and to bar or limit or adopt assumptions with respect to the kind of behavior things are harmful, it would get a fairly easy pass if it meant that same panel or some panel. As Sean said, nobody knows. That's just my prediction. Go ahead.
Can I just say, I don't disagree that that's certainly one of the perspectives, right? But the fact of the matter is those perspectives are going to continue to move forward, which means the FCC just will have to spend a lot of time and resources to litigate the whole thing. So, and no one knows the outcome. The other side of the equation will be deeply entitled to the
But the thing is, Sean, you're now in the private sector, so clients have to spend a lot of resources too. So you got to think about that.
All right, well, thank you guys. Let's turn to our final panelist, Nicole Turnley, who is the VP and Chief Research and Policy Officer for the Minority Media and Telecom Council, which is a national nonprofit dedicated to promoting and preserving equal opportunity and civil rights in the mass media, telecom, and broadband industries, and closing the digital divide. Nicole was appointed to the FCC's Federal Advisory Committee on Diversity in the Digital Age, where she chairs the FCC subcommittee on the use of unlicensed devices to increase minority innovation and entrepreneurship, among 1,000 other things.
Right, exactly. Thank you. And so I'm actually good because I got to go last, and then everybody who knows me knows I talk a lot, so I've got notes to kind of keep me focused here too. So I'm actually excited about this because we at MMTC chimed in. I think the first white paper that came out, we were one of the first civil rights groups to sort of come into the conversation around the update of the Telecom Act, because in one word, what has changed in the ecosystem is broadband, right? It has changed the way the communications ecosystem looks, and that innovation, I think, is outpacing the laws and regulations that are on the books. So I'm going to kind of talk about two big rocks, a framework just in general sort of responds to these guys in terms of where we should be looking at the COM Act. But then I'm going to drill down in particular on issues related to the communities that we serve and why the update of the COM Act is even more important and why this is a great time to actually do this update. One of the interesting things too I want to also lay forth when we have this conversation about the COM Act, and I'll say something about net neutrality, but I want to stay in the space of the COM Act, is the internet has also changed the way that we have other things interfacing in our ecosystem. Who would have thought that we would have talked about things like telehealth and telemedicine and e-government and distance learning and education? When the Telecommunications Act was written, we talk about railroads and telegraph. Now, I have little kids; they don't know what a beta VHS tape is, let alone a telegraph, right? They still understand the railroad, but they don't understand half of this. And if those college students know, there's just been a total transformation of the ecosystem, and we have to be very careful when we go into this update as to how we're creating it to be flexible enough so that we're not managing by titles anymore, and we're not managing by old rules, but we're allowing the ecosystem to grow in a meaningful way that the adjustment of these rules can actually keep up with the pace of innovation. And I think that's a really important point. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a sociologist, so I've seen the way the structural ecosystem continues to evolve, and I think if we look at the Telecom Act, we've got to be very conscious that we're not going to be back at this table in 5 years trying to figure out how we create other rules to accommodate the innovation that's already outpaced the last rules that we put into place. So I want to just offer a couple of thoughts just in terms of the big picture of the framework. I think the Congressman is right on point. We have to start with a pro-consumer benefit. A lot of times when we talk about the Telecom Act, we sort of start at the top as opposed to the bottom. The people that we're really trying to benefit are consumers, and we need to figure out a framework that optimizes the environment that they have been comfortable with, that they are used to, that allows them to continue to explore the innovation and the aspirations of the internet ecosystem and adjacent sectors that we're actually seeing. Tell somebody the other day, who would have thought like Uber would be like a technology company in transportation, right? We didn't even think about that. Back in the days, we were calling cabs, right? Now we're actually seeing the consumer driving much of the demand for the technology that we actually have today. My second point then, given the consumer benefit, we need to focus on the fact that when we go into a Telecom Act that is technology neutral. We did not have, with the railroad and the telegraph, a Facebook. We did not have a Twitter and Instagram. We actually didn't have this concept, right, of really what an ISP was back at that time. And now we actually have rules that govern each of these bodies differently, that's trying to keep up with the technology that they're advancing, when perhaps there's time to actually be much more agnostic in the way that we actually design the language because of the convergence of video, data, and voice. I honestly think, looking back at that, we may have less problems than we're experiencing today on that other issue had we had a Comm Act that was much more technology agnostic and treated people fairly in the ecosystem. I think third, that the regulatory framework should be much more flexible. Much of what we're experiencing, a lot of the telecommunications debates today and yesterday have a lot to do with the stringent strongholds and chokeholds of old regulations. Again, on my first point on how the system has actually evolved. So a much more regulatory approach as opposed to trying to impose rulemaking on, governing on this and governing on that without really thinking about, again, can we put in place a system that adapts to a lot of the aspirations, again, of the consumer and creates, I think somebody said earlier, the competitive environment which has actually created the space that we know today. I always remind people, for those of us, and I'm not going to tell my age, but I am old, for those of us that carried a bag phone back in the days when we were mobile, a lot of the innovations that we see today, as Rob said earlier, are just very new. And we have to be very focused on having the flexibility for that ecosystem to actually grow. I think the next point, and I'll be quick, I've heard a little bit of it here, but I think it's very important to the consumers that I represent, is the focus of the Telecom Act update on universal service reform. This is a key component of how to continue to develop these programs to be effective and efficient for people. And I think if we get into the debate of focusing on particular parts of the Act without keeping that at the crux of this dialogue, I think we miss out on the opportunity to do that which we are trying and attempting to do, which is to protect consumers from harm, while at the same time allowing them to, as Rob has said, to benefit from this new technological ecosystem. It is a shame that we still have 30+ million people that are offline in this country, and all of us in this room, in this small universe, which is multiplied by many other universes, actually benefit daily from technology and new technology. We have to figure out a way to action. I like what the Congressman said, and we endorse that as well. Finding ways to make the USF much more efficient, finding ways to streamline that process so it's easier to benefit from. I think it's part of the conversation and engagement we need to have with the USF. And then finally, I kind of want to bring this up, because I know I'm out of time, so I have to, it's my last point. Now, I was going to say something about the public interest standard too, Sean, you're not here. I was actually about to knock on your door and talk a little bit about the public interest standard, be a little bit more clearer as well too, in the Communications Act. But I really wanted to stress this final point around when we go into this dialogue about the update of the Comm Act, that we also pay attention to the fact that the ecosystem that uses technology is very diverse. And we have to find ways, and at MMTC, we're all about preserving and expanding minority ownership. Are there ways to actually leverage the development and the rewrite of this act to encourage and engage more people of color as owners? As a progressive community, it would appear to me that ownership should be at the core of many of the areas that we actually believe in, and ubiquitous access, right, in terms of ownership. When we talk about the AWS-3 auction, for example, $40 billion has been raised in that auction, but the extent to which in Section 309J of the Communications Act, designated entities have actually benefited from that $40 billion is still under question, right? We saw increased participation with the waiver of some of those rules, but at the end of the day, are we going to structure an act to actually allow more small businesses and those businesses owned by women and minorities to actively participate? Because guess what, folks? The people who are actually growing this ecosystem look like me. They are people of color. They are people who are, living in vulnerable areas that want to get online and want to participate. So we have to keep that in mind. And I think going back to Sharon's earlier point, I'll just bring this up with the MVPD thing. We also want to be clear that some of the advancements that were made as a result of the Comm Act don't go back. Things like Olive Card, right? That we actually look carefully at how we're actually taking on this issue and this conversation to keep advancing as opposed to regressing on that. And that's why I kind of go back, and I'll close because everybody else talked about net neutrality, so I'll talk about it. I mean, as a civil rights community, based on what I just said in terms of the framing of how I think we should really envision the rewrite of this act, if we start to put in this pro-consumer, ecosystem in terms of the innovation and advancement of these delights that we have all come to partake in, the question that becomes with net neutrality, how far do we want to go with stringent regulation that stifles what we're actually seeing in terms of these successes? So for us, for example, it's been a lot of conversation where the civil rights community stands, progressive, non-progressive, because we're heterogeneous. But the question becomes, if you put in a reclassification system with still so many people offline, though the outcome or the goal may be to use it to advance broadband adoption and deployment, the sacrifice may be prisoners that will not yet adopt the technology for the use of these things like telehealth, telemedicine, education, etc. So we have to be really careful about that. I think we propose Section 706, but unlike some of those that sit on the 706 side, we actually ask for stronger consumer protections, and we've actually put out some public comments on the use of Title VII, like the EEOC, so that consumers are not burdened by the fact that they have to bring a harm and they don't have a lawyer, or they spend the money to get a lawyer to actually mitigate what those harms might be. So again, you know, I hear from my lawyer friends, I hear from my non-lawyer friends, I hear from my academics, you know, this debate. I completely agree with much of what has been said. I really hope that we get out of this process quickly, because I don't think litigation and extensive litigation is going to advance any of the things that I just talked about at this table. And I really believe, as you know, I have to commend Sean for his work, so we will miss him here actually, for pushing forward the COMM Act. At the end of the day, most of what we're arguing about could actually be addressed in a revised Communications Act. And so if we start back there, we actually could find ourselves having a different conversation than one that pits polar opposites in terms of the regulatory approach. So I'll stop there, and you still have time left, Rob.
Thank you guys, that's all very helpful. We have about 7 minutes left, so we have time for another couple questions. Anyone have a question? Yeah, could you say who you are, where your affiliation is?
Yeah, Jared Reckles, I'm with Harry Reid's office. Looking for Robert, you sound like to some extent you were agreeing with the congressman about net neutrality debate and how that was sort of taking up the capital and oxygen in the air, and hoping to get rid of that in terms of helping push the telecom rewrite forward. Would you see reclassifying it as being more damaging? He was saying a lot of those are things where if you reclassify it, there'd be any chance of a rewrite going through, but not reclassifying it, does that seem like it would be quiet the issue down? I guess in my opinion, it would be that much better in terms of, oh, now the issue is dead if you didn't reclassify it, so now we can go ahead and just rewrite. It seems like either way, it's going to work its way into this debate and be a big thorn in the side throughout it. What do you see the best way to avoid that?
Well, it's a little bit sort of weird, strange situation we have where we're having this incredibly intense debate about this measure where, frankly, there hasn't been a lot of problems with it. You know, it could be, you never know. It's not like we're debating ISIS. I mean, okay, I get ISIS as a problem right now. We got to do something about it now. Net neutrality, okay, you know, we can wait a little bit. The sky's not going to fall. And at the same time, we're talking about rewriting the act. I think what Wheeler should do, Wheeler should say, I call on Congress to rewrite the act within 2 years and include a special provision. I agree 706 could do this, but it leaves it sort of, 706 is not the perfect, Title II is definitely not the right one, and 706 isn't okay, but it's not. Look, I think the answer is Congress puts in a provision in the act that talks about what are the core principles for net neutrality. And I would look at what the European Commission is just, not the European Parliament. The European Parliament went off the deep end, but the European Commission is a very, very balanced view that you can manage networks, you can have discrimination, quote unquote, as long as it's, you know, not any competitive thing to it. So I actually think if Wheeler goes to the Title II thing, I agree with the Congressman that basically Congress is just going to react to that. That's where the energy is going to go. If he goes and says, wait a minute, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to work on spectrum and digital divide. That's what I'm going to work on. And I'm going to let Congress deal with this for the next 18 months. And if they don't act, then I'll do something before I leave. That to me is what I would do. Just let everybody take a deep breath, call a timeout, and turn it over.
I think, you know, we can, there's one vision of how things could evolve next year. I think the chance of FCC, the chairman, not doing anything is like zero. So to the extent that the FCC will take out this item and they will do something, whether it's Section 706 or Title II, I think you're exactly right. The tension is going to be there. The other side will be fighting for it. And that's why I think Congress should, I mean, but regardless of what the FCC does, Congress should take on this responsibility and do something.
But if the FCC, let's say Chairman Miller says, I've heard what the president has to say, I've heard what the party has to say, I opt for the 706 approach, something like what I proposed in the notice. There's evidence that he's no longer there, even aside from the president, but let's say he did that. I think the most likely outcome there would be, I'm not making promises on behalf of my clients, I think the most likely outcome would be the rules are reasonable, the ISPs don't appeal. If they do appeal, as I said, I think 706 probably can support reasonable rules as long as they're not common carriers, so I think that's really easy. The other side, I think the public interest groups that want Title II probably appeal, but think of what their argument has to be. It has to be, it's unreasonable for the FCC to determine that this is one integrated information service. That's a hard argument to make because the Supreme Court held that's not true. The Supreme Court held in 2005 it was a reasonable choice, so they'd have to say things have changed such that it is much less an integrated service now, such that the FCC could not even reasonably determine it is. That's hard. There's actually a lot of evidence in the record to the contrary, that it's even more integrated service, that integrated information service. So I guess that's all to say, if the FCC went with the 706 approach, would we have legal conflict for a year or so? Probably. But I think after that, it would be calm, and what we've moved to is more of an enforcement-focused environment where groups that are putting energy now into Title II focus much more energy on monitoring ISP behavior and bringing complaints where they thought there were violations.
Can I just say a quick thing, and I agree with what was said on both sides. I think also by going into, if Congress focuses their energy on the Common Act, I think it will help negate some of the confusion that has actually resulted in this conversation on the reclassification side, so that, if Congress took more initiative to say we want to actually start here, sit within support and endorse the chairman on a Section 706 approach that at least allows us to have a holding period to sort of look at the big picture of where the ecosystem is going with this flexible approach and pro-consumer rules. I actually think, to your point, that after a year, we would actually be in a different state of discussion than we are now.
Time for one last question, and that's in the back.
Baron Soka, Tech Freedom. The chairman does have a real choice right now as to what his next step is. So short of waiting or issuing an order, he can issue a further notice of proposed rulemaking. There are good legal arguments to think that if he's going to reclassify, he really should do that. If he's planning to forbear, he may have to do that. And at a minimum, it would allow the chairman to do something while buying time for Congress to act. So I'm just curious about thoughts on the panel as to, do you see any reason why the chairman shouldn't issue a further notice, if only to make sure that whatever he does is upheld in court?
I think he will have to, and he is planning to, but that doesn't mean that it wouldn't be concluded by early part of next year. I mean, he can structure the comment cycles in a way that will still have the issue teed up at the first quarter of next year. That's not mutually exclusive.
No, I actually agree. I've said it's on record that I think there should be a further notice, particularly since most of the concern has been around Title II 706, and the notice did not call for enough on record about Title II. So it's almost like making a decision somewhat in the dark because you don't have a lot of record that actually substantiates the use of Title II. So I agree to buy some time in for Congress to sort this out, sort to the earlier question, so that this does not become a stalwart to stop other things that we actually have to focus on right now. And there are a lot of other things that I've been up all night that Congress needs to be focusing on right now. This is clearly, I think, a tool to actually move forward on this and get out of this quagmire.
But to Nicole's point, though, I think if the chairman does come out with a notice, careful, what you wish for, right? Like, the questions that are going to be focusing on will suggest whatever route that he's going to take. And so if he's asking questions about how to reclassify wireless services, he's going to go reclassification.
Yeah, I said, as long as he gets more time than that DE notice.
Sounds good to me.
So I've never worked at the FCC, and I sort of worked in Congress. So I'll say something that's really naive. Are we really going to spend an enormous amount of time and effort doing this Title II thing and going down that path when regardless of whatever the FCC chooses, it doesn't matter what they do, 706, nothing, or Title II, Congress will overrule it when Congress does a Telecom Act. And the odds of a Telecom Act happening within 3.5 years are probably pretty good. So it's just, why are we in a rush? My view is let's just wait. Let Congress do it. Now, politically, that's Tom Wheeler's going to get like 1,000 pickets in front of his driveway. decides to do that, but, you know, that in my view is the best decision.
One quick comment.
Yeah, so I'll make one quick comment, which is, as a lawyer who represents ISPs, I would just say, if there was no further comment, there is still more than sufficient record for the commission to forbear extensively. I don't want anyone coming back and arguing there was no record for forbearance. So I'm agnostic as to whether they seek further comment, but if they don't, I don't want to see lawyers arguing there was no record to support forbearance, because there was.
Right, well, that is less one. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for coming. The Public 3.0 will be focusing on this issue more digitally in the written form next year, so please check out for that. Thanks for everyone helping.